So it's my great honor to be able to introduce Chris Kaliebe. I've been looking forward to this talk because, as you'll see, Dr. Kaliebe is both humorous, but really thought-provoking and right on the mark with so many different things. So that's my informal introduction. But as far as all of his accolades, he's a graduate of Columbia University and St. George University School of Medicine, and currently associate professor of psychiatry at the University of South Florida. He has helped UCSF start a special, USF Psychiatry start a special track in integrative psychiatry in association with the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine called Integrative Medicine and Psychiatry, which Janice was talking about, that Nushin and I also helped coordinate. He, from 2013 to 2021, he served as co-chair of the media committee at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. His clinical work has been in university clinics and federally qualified health centers and juvenile corrections. In 2016, he helped start maintain yoga programs within the correctional centers where he works. And since 2020, he's served on the board of directors for Yoga for Change. He is an empirical skeptic, he says, and believes that humans, even psychiatrists, have the potential to be rational. However, rationality is not their natural state and will only be achieved in a culture of intellectual curiosity, respect, and open debate. He tries to stay consistent with his yoga practice and spending time in nature, and resides right now in Tampa, Florida. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Kaliebe.
Awesome. So I'm trying to give what I think is important for us as a society and a people, and just also within integrative psychiatry for us to consider, because there's been a lot of changes in the world that I think technology has brought on. I mean, humans are a tool using species, and our tools have changed quite a bit in the last few decades, faster than they ever have before. I think it's wrought a lot of changes. I do have to say, didn't go into medicine thinking I'd end up in what we are now calling integrative medicine. So I kind of came through a different route. And I have some empirical skeptic heroes, Steven Pinker and Nassim Taleb, Thomas Sowell. There's been a lot of stuff on race and gender recently. And, he's an amazing writer and thinks very clearly on those things. When I first got into mental health, Albert Ellis, who is sort of one of the two starters of CBT, and he calls his rational emotive behavior therapy. So there's a heavy emphasis on how much we fool ourselves and how human beings can be irrational, and that leads us to many, many problems. And he borrowed a lot from the skeptics and also from Buddhism. And I do believe those are sources of ancient wisdom that everyone can use, right? There's so much there, both in the skeptics and also in the Buddhists, in the skeptics, I should say the Stoics. And interestingly, Nassim Taleb leans heavily on the Stoics too. Only about 3 or 4 years ago did I hear about Hans Rosling, and I got him from a Steven Pinker book, so it's kind of funny. But he's a physician, in Sweden, who worked most of his life in Africa, and he wrote an incredible book called Factfulness, which I'll heavily emphasize, and I encourage you to look it up. And also his website, Gapminder. He passed away in 2017. I could have put even more books out there, but I've been reading a lot of books about mental health care and what's good about it and what's bad about it. And through the years, I think I've been influenced. I feel like when you do a traditional training program, they're going to tell you all the good things about psychiatry. And at the top is my brochure from the Preventing Overdiagnosis Conference in 2014. So I presented twice at the Preventing Overdiagnosis Conference, sort of before I was ever involved in any official integrative medicine stuff. I was skeptical about what large pieces of what is sort of traditional psychiatry. And some of it is about pharma, some of it is about how we do our diagnostics, some of it is how narrow we are, some of it is overselling certain, certain things that make money and underselling lots of other stuff. So, there's a lot there. Interestingly, the Tanya Lerman book Of Two Minds came out. It was probably like 99 or something. And I was doing my residency at the time. And I always thought it's interesting. It's Of Two Minds because it was a fight between like the biological psychiatrists and medicines and scans versus what at that point was the dominant other paradigm, which was psychoanalysis. So, now psychoanalysis has kind of faded, and we're more we use more a collective group of therapies. But I find it interesting. It wasn't Of Three Minds, which you would think if we were actually doing biopsychosocial psychiatry, we'd have three parts to it. So next, some of the first two, there's a lot of great people in integrative psychiatry, but the first two people that I read and I thought, wow, they make a lot more sense than most of the people in conventional psychiatry. And that's James Gordon and Scott Shannon. And so I read their books. I, met them at conferences. I'm, pretty friendly with Scott. I mean, they're eminently reasonable people and super thoughtful. And I really like how they practice and how they approach things. And I was like, wow, there's this whole world that, we really need more of these type of guys. And that could be a much bigger part of psychiatry than it is. And thankfully it's growing now. So, that's what we're part of. And on the side of all, as I sort of went through this journey, I mean, way back when I read this book almost probably like over 20 years ago. But this is before the internet that Joshua Mirowitz wrote it. But he talked about how culture and who knows what about whom and how information flows is all connected to what technologies we have. And every time a new technology comes, like the printing press, like radio, like telephones, like internet, like whatever, like smartphones, it sends a ripple through society and changes all sorts of stuff. But as we get more ability to keep communicating and everything has gotten democratized, we've exploded in lots of different ways in our culture. And there's the amount of information flow is now incredible. And we all have to be very careful about monitoring how information comes in and out of our brains because we are affected by it. Another person that I've read recently who I really like is Joseph Heinrich. And he talks a lot about culture. And being a child psychiatrist, you've heard this probably before, but basically children are in need of culture to be formed, right? And what he really clearly elucidates is that it's not so much that humans are all that smart, it's that our collective brains are all that smart. And a lot of that is transmitted through culture. And by working together, we've been able to achieve the amazing things that we've achieved. But we are made to learn socially and hone into each other and kind of, mimic each other. And that's sort of what we do naturally. And we really don't understand a lot of the stuff that is transmitted culturally, like why it works, but that's how we've been so successful as a species. And a good example is if you drop like any explorer in some place he's never been, he's just going to die, right? You need to have a culture that grows up in that environment and understands how to live there and what are the dangers and how to make food and all those type of things from what's in the environment. And why that's important for us to realize is that Western people, which is most of who we study in psychology, are weird. We're Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And most of the people that get in psychological studies are actually undergraduates who do psychology, or graduate students or other people pulled from Western universities. So a lot of our stuff that we think about how the mind works isn't really about how the mind works. It's about how the mind of people who go to Western universities minds work, which is very different because culture has made them very different. And finally now, part of the whole emphasis on weird is studying people from all over the world and seeing how they're different and noticing that Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people are not the normal human beings. Our culture has been shaped up over a really long time. And basically, a really compelling thesis that he has is the culture that we've made is he had these, we got to a place where we went from many gods to one all-knowing God. And we got a strong church that had what he calls the marriage and family plan, which pushed us into more monogamy, less polygamy, less cousin marriage, less clan-based stuff. And that, along with capitalism and democracy, has opened up a whole new world to us. So we're a culture is making us a very different type of human being than our ancestors, whereas our brains are less family-based, more individualistic, more analytic, but less holistic than we used to be. And we value and are able to work really well with abstract ideas. And one example that I think really brings things home is from Frank McCourt's Angel as Ashes. I don't know if you've read this book. I only found it within the last couple of years. It's amazing. But while I'm picking on religion a little bit, I go to church and I find a lot of value in it. But just as an inkling, so you can understand how church has shaped our society, that book would be a great example of someone who was born in 1930 in America, but then very soon after moved to Ireland and grew up in Ireland in a very tightly religious society. So he's 10 years old and he goes to confirmation, and the priest and master tell us that confirmation means you're a true soldier of the church and entitles you to die and be a martyr in case you're invaded by Protestants or Mohammedans or any other class of heathen. And he thinks at 10, more dying. I want to tell them I won't be able to die for the faith because I'm already booked to die for Ireland. Because his dad would come home drunk and get him up and have a march at night. And they were ready. He was telling them that he needs to die for Ireland. So how is he going to die for the church? He's going to die for Ireland. And while that's a sad and funny story, it tells you how these societies in some ways were so successful. They shaped up their soldiers to be ready to fight and die for their community and made those communities. And if you weren't ready to do that, your community, and you didn't get enough people ready to do that, the other community that was ready to do that would overrun your community and your genes would not move on and your story would not be told. So that's how life was for a very, very long time, and things were very rough. And we've now gotten to a place where not that many people are dying in war these days. But that was the standard through tens of thousands of years back in history. Steven Pinker has documented all that stuff quite well. And you have to understand some of those dynamics to understand where we're at in our society. Now, fast forward to where we are today and what I think is important for us to navigate our media environments. Heinz Rauslin book, once again, he was a doctor, mostly in Africa. And at the end of his life, he wrote this book. And he talks about how the world is actually better than we think it is. And we fool ourselves into being more negative than we need to. And how we can get fooled. I put up this great article from The Onion. Aspirin taken daily with a bottle of bourbon reduces awareness of heart attacks. I mean, it sounds really good, but probably that's not how it's probably not that great. Anyway, that's if you don't know The Onion, you made up. So I'm going to go through these guys. The one that he thinks is most important is the gap instinct. So when you see a presentation and people are giving you two numbers and they're saying like, look how bad this is. Look how, look how separate these two groups are. Look at the difference. What he wants you to do is look at the big group in the middle and see how much overlap there is. Because if you look at the graph of what's going on with that, you get an idea of what the actual populations are and what the actual differences are. And we like to sort of separate the world into groups naturally. It seems to be part of the human psyche. And then we usually are trying to figure out like one's on the, one's the bad group and one's the good group and how different they all are, when really we're much more in the middle. And the news and people in, who have agendas tend to want to create these gaps. That's what they do. The negativity instinct. So good news isn't news. So if you watch the news, you think you're getting smarter, but you're really getting dumber because all you're seeing is all the bad stuff that happens all over the world, and you're not noticing all the good things that are happening. I mean, the New York Times could have printed, 100,000 people got out of extreme poverty today, every day for the last 20 plus years, but that's not what they print. They don't print all these successes we've had. They print the bad stuff, and they print the most alarming bad stuff. And that's how they sell papers. And that's, it's not their fault. That's they're competing, and they need to make money, and they want to get eyebrow. They want to have eye seen. But mostly what you're going to see in the news is just the bad stuff. And you have to realize most progress is gradual, and you have to compare how things used to be to the way that they are. One of his things that he also says is, obviously we have all these, innate evolved things that will manage fear, and our attention filter goes for anything that we think will get us. But we really need to look at what is our risk, which is danger times exposure. And that you have to calculate that, and you have to sit down and think about these risks, and you got to know the numbers to know which risks you really need to worry about. And it seems like it's really easy for us to fear certain things. And although a lot of the stuff that gets us, we don't fear. And, one of the things that's great about integrative medicine and integrative psychiatry is we tend to focus on self-care, nutrition, physical activity, calming ourselves, all those things that in the long run are going to make us successful and have us live a long time. It's very unlikely that we're going to be that person in California that, just got killed by a shark, but it made the national news, So the one person that gets killed by a shark makes the national news, whereas most people don't, are dying from some self-care related issues, right? And that's where we need to really focus, is the things that are most likely to affect us. Plus, graphic events pull people into the news and are great for news organizations. So they're going to show them again and again and again and again. And so you can look back at 9/11, and I don't think it's now controversial, but you could say those planes hitting the towers put in place a whole bunch of dysfunctional narratives that grew and caused a whole bunch of problems. And we were pulled in by those images and overly fearful, and our own negativity bias causes us to notice those things more, and that's what's given to us. And then we end up overreacting and doing things that don't make any sense because of these high graphic events that really pull us, right? So those are the things they're going to put in front of us. And the next thing he says is you got to respond to the numbers, and you got to check how much is something happening, what is the amount, of something. So when people give you like this many people died, or this number of this happened, you have to say, like, if it's what he calls a lonely number, it's meaningless. You have to know, what was the number 10 years ago? What was it 100 years ago? Or divided by what? What's the population? What's the actual incident rate of that? So that we know per person how often this is happening. And then we can decide if that's an important number and something we need to act on. And, right now, we seem to have a lot of groupthink and confirmation bias. So groupthink is when it's like a committee that does stuff that's influenced by the internal dynamics of that committee. And then you have confirmation bias, which hopefully you've heard of this quirk in human nature, but most people tend to search for and interpret and favor and recall information that confirms their beliefs that they already have. So they always keep looking for stuff that makes them think that, oh yeah, I'm right. I looked it up on Google and I saw the first thing I agreed with, and then now I'm sure that I'm even more correct. And in groups, when you have a bunch of people who only deal with their own group and they tend to have a lot of the same opinion, or you have people who don't want to have honest, open conversation, then they tend to demand conformity. If there is disconfirming information, they just will ignore it. And it's easy for them to demonize the people on the other side. And so these are sort of traits of groups. And this is how you could get some pretty crazy beliefs within a group, because, if someone's like, I believe in X or Y, let me show the group how much I believe in it. So I believe so much in, free markets that I'm going to say, I want them to put a parking lot over the whole, Brazilian rainforest, because that's going to show how into capitalism that I am. And maybe within this one group, that makes me kind of a star, even though my idea doesn't make any sense in real life, right? So within groups, you tend to get groupthink and you get extreme ideas the more the group sort of silences debate and doesn't look for alternatives. And we really want to get it going. And I think in complementary and alternative or integrative medicine, that this is, we're, I think, following the evidence and have made it to a place where we're seeing the world more clearly and that we have more free thinking and we're more able and willing to say whatever we think and explore things. Whereas in conventional medicine, they tend to want to stay in the lane that they're already in. And I think that's part of why they failed to progress in a lot of ways, whereas we are paving new paths that they do not pave. So the dramatic attention filter, this is something, I mean, from everything that happens, only so many get through and your senses, and then you pick what you think is right. And right now, in 2018, there was 33 zettabytes, and now there will be 175 zettabytes of data by 2025. And what consumes into this, Herman Simon in 1962, what information consumes is the attention of its recipients. So a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And you'll notice, and this is not even a large curve, this book, but this is worldwide, how high our rates of ADHD medication is, right, and prevalence is compared to the rest of the world. And since ADHD has been such a growth business, and there may be, I'm sure there are other factors, and I would argue for a number of other factors why it's a growth business. I think the growth of data and the growth of information has to be considered as a source of why so many people are saying that they can't focus and they can't pay attention. And there's a lot of great books pushing back against the idea of ADHD. And I think a lot of people don't understand the history of stimulants and how they were used since the 30s and all the things that have happened with them. I mean, I'm not anti-stimulants, but I think people ought to know better about what their history is and how they've been used and what the problems have, because a lot of people see them as a cure for an illness, and it's much more complicated than that. And at this point, with all the business, it's a $16.4 billion industry of stimulants, right? Or ADHD medicines worldwide. And the crazy thing is, it's like a 9 billion of that is just America. So America is concerned is over half of the world's ADHD budget. And if you know this book, The Healthy Deviant, Pilar Gerasimo calls it a rule breaker's guide to being healthy in an unhealthy world. I highly recommend it. And one of the things I really like about her is her framing is, if you're in an unhealthy culture, you have to be the weird one in order to be healthy. So it's okay to be weird, not just Western industrialized or democratic. I'm saying you have to do things a little strange and be a deviant to be healthy in an unhealthy culture.